Welcome everybody to one of our Shine Spotlight sessions where I'm joined by Anoushé. The Spotlight sessions are part of the theme of this year's Connect, really, where we're getting to hear much more about people's lived experience, people's stories, and more of the story behind just the diagnosis. So I'm really happy to be joined by Anoushé today. So she can talk to us a bit about her experiences. I think it's fair to say Anoushé lives with quite a number of health conditions, cancer being just one of them. But it was after her cancer diagnosis in 2013 that Anoushé took up paraclimbing to help with her rehabilitation. And she subsequently just smashed it and became ranked second in her category in the whole of the UK within 3 years. So also, as your interest in that sport grew, you kind of wanted to kind of broaden the availability of that sport to people with all sorts of different disabilities. And Anoushé founded Paraclimbing London in 2018, which is an initiative to make it more accessible. I could go on. Anoushé recently gained a Guinness World Record for the most meters climbed one-handed in an hour, which is just amazing. I'd love to see that video.
On YouTube.
Oh, there you go.
It's like Guinness themselves did like an edited feature video thingy. There you go.
Well, maybe
super eloquently put, I did.
And away from work in sport, Anoushé also blogs and speaks publicly about her experiences. So today, we're really lucky to have her here. We're going to hear a bit about Anoushé's experience of being diagnosed with cancer, a little bit about the resilience required to get her to the position she's now in. And then we thought we'd also look a little bit about the gap between the public and the private face of managing the condition she does. So like I said, there's lots of time for questions at the end, or do put them in the chat as they come up and as we go along, and we'll try and get to them. So should we start? I mean, this isn't the beginning. It's often that start at the very beginning. This isn't the beginning at all, but it's the beginning of your cancer experience. You were diagnosed in 2013, am I right? And
2011 actually. So yeah, I don't know where 2013 is when I moved to London. So yeah, 2011, it was an accidental diagnosis, like I guess most diagnoses would be. I'd had a period of ill health that had multiple surgeries because we didn't know at the time I had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder, which means I don't produce collagen correctly, so my connective tissue is loose and stretchy. In layman's terms, it means my joints pop out of place, and that's how it impacts me. But there's 13 types, and the other types are more severe and can impact vascular structures, and also, internal organ placements and things like that. So for me, it's mainly things do not stay in place, and I sprain things and dislocate things. I was having a lot of trouble and was having surgery. So 18, 20, 21 back surgery. I wasn't healing from the back surgery. So about a year afterwards, they decided to do a back and a stomach scan. They caught my boob in it, and happened to see a tumor. Now I was 22 at the time. Fast forward, I turned 23. The tumor has now, this is 6 months later, the tumor is now gone from 2 to 6 centimeters. So they've gone, even though it's benign, because I'm far too young to have cancer, let's take it out, because now it's getting to be a problem where if they take it out any later, it won't be like aesthetically pleasing, was the argument. So my gynecologist took out the tumor. Fine. I get a call. It's all benign. And I'm actually in the middle of a university. I was doing my master's, and I'm in the middle of a university party where we were celebrating the end of the year when I got the call. So I literally had to walk off into a corner, get the call. Yeah, you're all good. Fine, come back to the party. And that was that. I was fine. About 2 weeks later, I was doing some studies. I was sitting in the lounge and the phone rings. My parents were still very much so landline present at the time. So I picked up the landline, answered the phone. It's the doctor's secretary. He says, it's Thursday, but do you mind coming in Saturday? The doctor would like to see you. I'm like, fine. I was born and grew up in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is a very small country. I thought the doctor wanted to go on holiday early. And so I thought he was bringing me on Saturday to just deal with stuff. I didn't get told to bring anybody with me. I just got told to calm down. It was a lovely summer's day. Went to the doctor's at 10 in the morning and go in, and I noticed, with hindsight now, I noticed I was the only one in the hospital that day. The doctor was in his civilian clothes. There was no secretary present. And he comes out, there's nobody else in the waiting room, like literally the outpatient was completely empty. And he calls me into his room and he says, I know we told you 3 weeks ago everything was fine, but we've actually found anomalous cells. Now, we were speaking in French, so in my head, I'm going, translating it quickly and going anomalous, abnormal. Oh no, abnormal. Oh no. And then I'm like, what do you mean by anomalous cells? He goes, well, they're anomalous cells. I'm like, in my head going, normal, abnormal, not normal. Oh, cancer. And then I sort of went to my doctor and said, do you mean cancer? And he says, yes, I mean anomalous cells. I'm like, no, you're going to have to say cancer. I'd been ill already for several years. I'd been going through surgery after surgery for several years. I'd had a real decline in the relationship with my body. I didn't trust my body. I hated what I was turning into in terms of physically. I blamed her for whatever was going on. We didn't know I had EDS at the time, so I had no explanation for why my body was failing me, aside from the fact that she was failing me, and there was nothing I could do to stop that. So I needed to believe what he was saying. And if he was telling me it was cancer, and, you know, like most people who haven't had cancer, I had the images of people dying, right? Like you don't get, you know, the losing the hair, all the rest of it, you don't get. It's not until you cross that veil that you really understand what cancer treatment's all about. So I needed to understand what he meant. And he was like, yeah, no, it's cancer, but we think we've caught it in good time. And he said then and there, he doesn't think I'm going to need to do chemo. So he's like, okay, 6 days later, redo the surgery to get margins. Then I had a port fitted in my right arm because I only have my left hand, and they didn't want to put the chemo through my veins. So they were trying to avoid long-term damage. And then I had an ovary preservation surgery. So I've got half an ovary sitting in Belgium right now. Then that was it. Then I started chemo. It turns out I went to see my oncologist, and the day I saw my oncologist, that morning I'd seen my GP, the gynecologist, and my physiotherapist, all of them saying, oh yeah, we know who your oncologist is going to be. She's not going to give you chemo. We know her. She loves young people. Great. Turn up to see her. She's really bright and chirpy. She wears the most colorful clothes. I don't know what it is about oncologists who dress up really brightly. I think they do it because they have to deal with so much difficult news. And I go into the room, and I left my mom out in the waiting room, which she's so pissed off about. And I went into the room, and the doctor sort of closes the door and says, so are you a direct person, or are you a beat around the bush person? I said, if you're having to ask me that question, it means you have something entirely shit to tell me. Can we just get on with it? She says, I like you. I'm like, I'm not sure I'm going to like you by the end of this. And yeah, effectively, she was like, we had an MDT, and a decision was taken that even though we caught your cancer late stage 2, the way your cancer presented and the way your body is, we think we need to chuck everything at it. So we're doing chemo. You're going to, and she's like, you told me not to beat around the bush. You're going to lose everything, your eyebrows, your eyelashes, everything's going to go. It's going to be awful. You're going to really struggle on cycles 3 and 4 because that's where everybody struggles. We're probably going to need to hospitalize you for some of that. And then we're going to do the radiotherapy, and then you're going to be on tablets for 5 years. So tamoxifen. Came out of that meeting, freaked out, and then had to go to a dinner with my friends who was announcing her engagement. So not the easiest of days at all. And I think it's that one of those things where you kind of just go into this sort of like it, probably anybody in the initial diagnosis of the cancer world, you just go into this phase of fight or flight. You've just got to go through it, don't you? You don't really have a choice. You get bombarded with all these appointments. You get bombarded with not feeling well due to treatment. You get bombarded with everything else. All that, you just don't have the capacity to emotionally process anything that is going on. At least I didn't. And as a consequence, I started psychosomatically puking every time I saw something red. So anytime I saw a red liquid, because it was the color of my chemo, I would be up chucking everywhere. So that and salt and vinegar crisps. So the problem was I had to get hospitalized because they approached me for red chemo, and I started puking before the chemo started. And it was so bad that actually they had to assign me a psychologist so I could start learning to do dual awareness therapy. So whenever I'm in any medical procedure now, I'm always on a beach in Barcelona with a cocktail in my hand, with an umbrella, and the sun is shining. And that's what I do. Anytime I have any difficult anything, colonoscopies nowadays, anything going on, anytime I'm uncomfortable, I'm on that beach in Barcelona until the appointment's done. And that's how I get through my stuff now. And people keep saying I'm really calm. I'm like, yeah, because I'm in Barcelona right now. So that was my time. Treatment was treatment, like anybody else. It's treatment. And in my case, I was in the middle of doing my master's at the same time, so I was juggling trying to attend classes. I remember when my eyebrows came off, I'd been washing my face and my eyebrows just went. And I had class that afternoon, and I told my mum categorically, I'm not going to class until somebody tells me how to draw eyebrows. And so she rushed me to a Sephora, and I went in and said, somebody teach me how to draw eyebrows. So they taught me how to do it. And then from that day, I started going in with my new eyebrows. I didn't tell anybody aside from my very close friends who'd been at the dinner on that first night, and my parents and my brother, and that was it. We didn't tell anybody because before me, somebody else in my community had been diagnosed with cancer, and she had a really, really late diagnosis, and so it meant her treatment was really rough. She's fine now, but the number of inappropriate questions that were coming towards her as an 18-year-old it wasn't okay in my books. She was getting asked about marriage prospects and fertility, and this is when they didn't even know she was going to survive the treatment and the subsequent surgeries. So I just didn't want to put myself into that space of vulnerability, so I didn't say anything. And it meant, and Luxembourg being a very small country, I didn't know anybody my age going through cancer treatment, let alone my cancer treatment. I did get put into a support group, but I was the youngest person by about 30 years. And so when they all started complaining about their side effects and I joined in, they went, well, you're young, so you shouldn't have to complain. So, and I remember on my last day of chemo, my nurse sort of went, well, there you go, you're done. That was a blip in history. You can carry on as normal as of tomorrow. So I felt like the youth I had meant that the perception of my symptoms weren't necessarily taken as seriously, and the trauma of my experience wasn't necessarily taken as seriously. I was just expected to just get on with it, and which is what I did. 6 weeks after I finished radiotherapy, in fact, the day after radiotherapy, I had a university exam, and 6 weeks after radiotherapy, I had my first job, and they did not know I'd had cancer, despite the fact that I'd had my eyebrows were still being drawn on. Didn't have my hair back, and yeah, I was starting full-time work within. I was nuts. I was constantly in and out of hospital with infections because I was pushing myself far too hard, and that was what it was. And it wasn't until I moved to London in 2013. So I finished cancer treatment. Radiotherapy was 19th of Jan 2012. I moved to London in October 2013, and it's then that I started therapy because I realized, one, I was away from home, so I could start therapy, but also it was a time when I really realized my emotional bandwidth had been reduced. So I saw funny things on TV and I wasn't laughing. I saw sad things, I wasn't crying. It was just, I was kind of a bit numb. So I decided to start therapy then to just start unpacking, not just that, but some very difficult personal life circumstances that I'd been through around the same time as well. So yeah, that was my experience basically.
And it's so, we hear it a lot, this idea that because you're younger, you'll bounce back. Don't worry, you'll bounce back because you're healthy and you're young and you're
live in your history, right?
Exactly. And it's just this kind of, the fallacy of that is, I think, can be really damaging for people who might have long-term effects or struggle with the emotional side and processing.
Or even the fact that insurance might get more expensive, or we don't know the long-term side effects, even of treatments that finished years ago. We still don't know all of that. So, and everybody reacts individually as well. So you might have, and I seem to be, the doctors like to call me a bit of a special medical case. I seem to have the rarer things in most of the time. So it whenever I get something, it's not frequent, which means I tend to turn up at a doctor's appointment and they go, oh, it's you. What other weird thing have you got now?
Yeah, I fall into that category too. Yeah, but I think it's often, I mean, as a young person, it's more unusual for you to get cancer in the first place. And then, yeah, like we were talking before, weren't we, about the longer term effects that treatment has had on you, and the fact that you do live with various other conditions. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how you manage these as a whole shebang.
Yeah, so one of the things that I now live with is lymphedema down my left arm. Now, I wasn't supposed to get it because we did everything we could to make sure I wouldn't get it by not putting chemo through my left arm and things like that. And I had that list that they give everybody who's had breast cancer to not do things. So don't, go near hot objects, don't garden without gloves, all the rest of it. It just so happened I was in London. I was coming back from visiting my grandparents in Pakistan. I'd taken a long haul flight, burnt myself in the oven, gotten a thorn in my hand from a rose, all in the same week, and suddenly up came the lymphedema. I was already having trouble with my left arm, so I probably had underlying lymphedema that hadn't quite presented itself. I had damage down my left arm in terms of scarring from the lymph nodes coming out. Now, that normally doesn't happen in most people, but it's because of a complication of EDS. Just meant my scarring is worse than the average scarring, but what is average? I would dare say. So yeah, if you're having problems, go get checked. And so effectively, one of the problems I have is I struggle raising my right arm above shoulder height, left arm above shoulder height. So that's impacted at the time in 2013, in 2011, 2012, when this was all happening, it was impacting, brushing hair, drying hair, putting socks on, repetitive movements. Still now, stirring pots at the kitchen counter is still painful. I don't hang up my clothes because I can't physically do it. My husband has to do it for me. So it's one of those things where it has actually impacted my daily ability to live my life. Which was a major problem. And that's actually where the climbing came in, because when we started noticing this was happening, one of my best friends, we'd both been on a school trip when we were 8. We both tried climbing. She loved it and became a climber. I loved it. My parents went too dangerous. And then fast forward 15 years, she'd been trying to persuade me to come to the climbing wall with her all of these years. And I kept going, well, parents are going to say no, parents are going to say no. And then I'd been a competitive swimmer and martial artist and stopped all of those when I was 16 and because of health. And my friends sort of went, look, you've been trying loads of other sports and stuff to try and find something compatible with your health. It's not working. Your left arm, you kind of need it. There is no right arm to take over. You need to find a way to get around this. So come climbing, because it's going to force your left arm to get above your head. Logical argument, but I was really struggling with the body changes I was going through because I'd been sedentary because of all the surgeries. I didn't have a good relationship with my body image at all. I had disordered eating. There was a lot of pressure to get back to normal after treatment, and all of that. And I was really feeling that. And I sort of went to her and sort of said, look, I won't look right. People are going to say I don't belong because I wear a headscarf and I'm 1.5 handed, and I'm going to look silly when I fall. And what happens if I fall and hurt myself? And whatever, every excuse under the sun I could find. And my friends just sort of went, you're scared. Yeah, I am scared. And she said, look, what's the worst that can happen? Worst that can happen is you're not going to like the sport. You move on. Best that happens is it changes your life. Couldn't argue against that. Agreed to go. Toes hurt like hell, like any new climber. Hand hurt a lot. But while I was awful, like actually awful. I spent most of the time sitting on the floor. But for the few seconds I was climbing and trying to coordinate my body and my balance and my movement and the timings and everything, there was a point where I just forgot I'd been ill. I actually just was a climber, because you have to be so mindful when you're climbing, especially when it's easy climbs, maybe not so much. Once it starts engaging you, and especially if you're scared of heights or something, you're so scared of heights that you forget that you're ill because you're so just busy surviving. In some cases, for people who do have height issues or fears around any of that, then for them it's genuinely like they're walking out of their comfort zone. So for me, climbing was never meant to become competitive. It was just something that made me feel normal, and it was that normality feeling that made me go into the gym and start doing some cardio and do some machines and get a little bit fitter. But it wasn't so I could do anything with the climbing as much as it was just have a nice time. And fast forward, I moved to London in 2013, didn't know anybody. Fast forward 2 years more, I moved into a new flat. My flatmate heard about a new climbing wall, or a climbing wall that was really famous. I by then hadn't climbed properly for a while and was really missing it. So learned to do my knots and a taster course. I knew how to do that. And we said, look, why don't we just go do this sport as a social thing for us to get to know each other. And sort of the idea was to go and be bad at it together. It wasn't really something, it was just to go and have some fun. And yeah, that swiftly changed in my case. Yes, I still go and have lots of fun on the wall, don't get me wrong. But within about 3 weeks, I found out there were paraclimbing competitions, which I was fascinated by, because in Luxembourg, it's a very small country. Para sport is generally the Paralympic sports. And growing sports it's still moving away from the medical model of disability, where you are disabled by your diagnosis rather than disabled by the barriers of society, which we do more in the UK, which is the social model of disability. So I was just fascinated that there were para sports and sports that weren't Paralympic sports. And so I said, no, I'm not going to the competition, because even though it's at my climbing wall in 3 weeks, I have never been to a competition without training. Even though it was an all levels, all abilities competition, and there would have definitely been something I could have climbed, that just wasn't in me to do that. And I was like, if I'm going to go to a competition, it's there to do right for me. And I know that's completely individual to everybody's experiences. So the year later, a couple of months later, I picked up a coach, and that year I started competing and like training and actually ranking. So yeah, I effectively took on a second place ranking in the UK in the first year I was actually competing, which is, I thought it was a complete fluke, which is why I decided to compete the next year. Turns out I did it again, and then it wasn't a fluke anymore. So, but it was like one of those, it was a very surreal experience doing that.
I think as well, like hearing you talk about it, like the shift in the way you describe your relationship with your body, from how you felt before you started that in terms of your sort of your body image and how you felt about it, to that changing that narrative around that, like what does my body do and what can it do and what do I feel confident with it doing? Seems like the sport really shifted that for you.
It was cancer and the sport. So cancer for me was an awakening, in the sense that I no longer saw it as my body failing me as much as it was my body yelling out for help. That the cancer happened because my body couldn't cope anymore. Whatever, and we all know there are different reasons, and there's all debates about why cancer happens to people. And taking all of that aside, for me, it was cancer has happened because my body could not have it happen. So ultimately, I saw that as like a massive alarm bell of, yeah, my body's failing me, but what if I'm failing her? And so it started changing the relationship with my body, and I started finally listening to her. So I started getting more in tune with my body then. But the climbing, yeah, if you're not in tune with your body and you want to take climbing to a serious level, you're not going to manage. Like, you do need to start listening to your body when you're climbing, because it's actually a very all-encompassing sport, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. You will see when somebody's nervous on a climb wall. It's really obvious. When somebody's nervous, when somebody's stressed from their day at work, or stressed from family life, or whatever, it's really obvious on a wall when that's happening. So climbing kind of forces you to become very in tune with yourself. So yeah, there was an element of transformation through that. Absolutely. But there was, the reality was, yeah, I was succeeding at the climbing wall, but I couldn't physically walk from the tube station to the climbing wall. It's a 9-minute walk. I couldn't do it. I'd take the bus or I'd take a taxi. I couldn't do my warm-ups. The coach kept telling me off because I wasn't warming up, but the warm-up would tire me out so much that I couldn't actually physically climb afterwards. So I was still building back. Like, yeah, it sounds really successful, and publicly that's what it is. But that didn't mean there wasn't a hell of a battle and a lot of choices being made on how I would live my life. And I was also developing gut issues. They thought I had Crohn's. I was struggling with my eating. Turns out I actually have celiac disease, and it had caused Crohn's symptoms. So thankfully, now that I'm gluten-free, I'm a lot better. But it meant at one point I was living off blended chicken and rice. I couldn't even eat raw fruit. So can you imagine trying to climb like an athlete, but living off stuff that effectively makes you malnourished? And it reminded me of chemo times, because I could basically only live on passion fruit juice and veal, which is grim. I haven't touched veal since. I don't really drink passion fruit juice.
Definitely an interesting combination.
Yeah, my mom made me do it because she believed it would grow my white blood cells. Yeah, I had all those superstitions hit me.
But it's interesting hearing you talk about a little bit about the sort of the public face of success, which, you know, you've had many successes, which is a wonderful thing that should be celebrated. But also, we were talking a bit before, weren't we? We don't want this to be a sort of like hero beats cancer story, because you were saying that the private experience is very different from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I guess this goes into why I started blogging in the first place. So when I was going through my cancer treatment, I felt incredibly isolated. I didn't have anybody my age that I could speak to who was going through a similar experience, if not the same. All the adults in my community who did know about stuff, so my medical team and my parents were just like, get on with it. And it was interesting because my dad got diagnosed with cancer the year I came to London. And so it was interesting because he came to me for support because he was getting that same reaction of just get on with it, because everybody had seen me get on with it because that was the expectation. And actually, it was so nice to be able to help him and say, look, don't expect him to just get on with it. You know, what he's saying is valid. And then when I moved to London and actually went to my first Shine meeting, I met so many other people who were talking about that same sense of isolation and loneliness, that I was like, one, I'm not alone, but why is this a thing? Why is it? Why should people ever feel this in any aspect of their lives? I'm not just talking about cancer treatment, I'm talking about everything. Why should people feel alone? There's what, 8 billion people on this planet? Surely there's somebody we can talk to about our experiences and feel validated by that, right? And that was for me the catalyst to starting to share my journey. But the problem is, I hadn't told anybody I'd had cancer. How do I do that publicly enough? And I remember telling my mom, I'm going to start blogging about cancer. And my mom went, you can't. It's not your story to tell. You need my permission. I said, actually, I'm the one who went through it. It is my story to tell. I'm asking your permission out of courtesy, but this is also just a courtesy. I will be sharing my story on my own terms. And it was really interesting because it took me a year from there to finally decide to come out. And actually, I remember doing a Shine podcast with Tatum and actually didn't share it on social media because effectively that was my first time talking about cancer, but I shared it with a few friends who didn't know I'd had cancer but were with me in Luxembourg, and they couldn't believe it because I lost my eyebrows in an oven accident and they believed me. So my friend who's a photographer had been taking pictures and she looked back at the pictures and, oh my God, yeah, you did have cancer. You were looking really ill, but we all believed you'd had an accident with the oven and you were studying too hard, which is why you looked pretty ill. And we managed to and also because I wear a headscarf, we style my scarf slightly differently. So people just thought I was having a fashion trend issue or something, not that I actually lost my hair. Like your hairline tells you where your scarf is supposed to stop. So sometimes it'd be a bit too low, a bit too high, because obviously my eyebrows, yes, I was having all sorts of issues with my scarf. And when the mouth ulcers got really bad, I just started staying at home a lot more and spending things. And my parents just said I was too busy studying. It was so easy to hide. But that meant that when I'd finished it and I was wanting to talk, I had nobody I could talk to because I'd been lying for months and months and months. And I also just didn't want to deal with the questions around marriage and fertility and blah, 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 that comes from my community inevitably. And probably comes for a lot of communities, but it's very strong in our community. So yeah, so I did my first podcast. I felt really good about that. And then I decided to go public on live radio. My dad was listening live. My mum was super against it. So she decided she wasn't going to interact with any of my public work. And my dad just sent me a message, said, I'm really proud of you. And he became my super fan after that. He fangirls all of my stuff still today. But it was just nice knowing at least I had one parent in my court. And then my mum heard one of my talks later that year, and then she realized I wasn't doing it for me. I was doing it to help others. Yes, for me, in the sense I share my journey, it becomes catharsis, but actually you also relive your trauma, and so you need to process. But more than that, it meant other people can feel they can also share their own journeys. That if one person, you can't, often people can't be what they can't see. And I've just decided to ignore that and go, I'm going to be that person so other people can then follow and do their own thing and enable them. And that's kind of why I decided to do it. But I have boundaries when I share stuff and stuff. So I only share when I've processed. Because what happens if you get a troll or a dickhead that turns up and says stuff? I hold multiple identities. I'm a Muslim, I wear a hijab, I have a visible disability, I had cancer, I live with the side effects of cancer, I have EDS, I'm now an ambulant wheelchair user. You can get a lot of silly people online who might say stuff. So I always sort of check myself before putting something out. So for instance, this week I put something quite powerful on my personal social media, on not personal, my Facebook page, because I have been going through some mental health stuff linked to another cancer side effect that's come out, which I'm still processing. And while I haven't been prepared to say what that is yet, the fact that I'm processing, because I always promised myself that I would share the good, the bad, and the ugly on social media, because public social media can be so like happy. Like even when people are doing sad things, they're putting happy faces on it. Like happy smiley photographers and portraits of people talking about sad things. And I just felt like it was really impostery and fake happy. And I was like, I'm not doing that. Yeah, I'm going to be happy when I'm happy. I might be quiet when I'm processing, and when I'm ready to say, I'm going to put something when I'm ready to say. And that's how I've done it. And I've only done it when every part of me has been ready to do that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It sounds like it's about finding the spaces where you feel comfortable sharing honestly, and then even in those spaces, filtering that and keep checking back in to see when you're ready to share particular bits of it.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll notice if you look at my first blogs with This Girl Can, I didn't actually say I'd had cancer until like the third blog in. I kept talking about a health condition, but actually I didn't actually use the word cancer until about second, third blog in. And it's from there that I've just gradually changed my rhetoric and grown it, and then decided to take on indoor climbing Everest for Shine in 2017. I think that basically planted the flag in the sand in terms of talking about cancer, at least.
Yeah, that was fantastic. But it's interesting talking about those moments. Like you say, there continue to be bumps in the road, there continue to be difficult things that come out, and in order to keep getting back after those kind of what can feel like relentless rug pull moments, it takes like an awful lot of resilience, doesn't it? And I know there's no magic step-by-step guide to coping with downtimes and difficult times, but what do you have anything that you do, that you kind of your routines that you go to just keep on trucking, as it were?
Yeah, so I have a few routines. One is the self-check-in. So I'm checking with myself at least every 3 months, and probably sooner if I'm having an existential crisis, because that's my body telling me I need to check in. So if I'm overwhelmed, if I'm having a poor mental health day in particular, that's my body saying, oi, we need to have a conversation, something's not quite right. And I'll sit down and have a conversation with myself, or freak out on the floor sobbing in a door frame because I've sat down and gone, life's not great. But ultimately that's my body and I having a conversation and going, something's really not right. Now it could be I'm grieving over something that's happened, and that's just something has triggered that off to come back, because grief is not linear and new normal is not linear. And even though we might all be in a new normal, that doesn't mean we don't get to grieve for our old selves and what could have been. It could be that something new has happened, like in my case, something new has happened and it's very upsetting, and I'm not there yet, and I am just beginning to accept that the new normal is coming, but I'm not willing to accept the new normal yet. I'm still very angry about it. So yeah, sit down and have that moment. And, whether that means you take a sick day if you're working, a duvet day, just a day, I just call in. I've actually called in sick and said, I can't work today. I'm not in that space. And I will take that day to just be with myself. If you're at home and you can't be with yourself because you have company or things like that, try and find a way to give yourself some space. If not, means go out for a cup of coffee and don't be near anybody. Just, you can be around people, but not interacting. You see what I mean? Just to have your own space to think and put some music on or go into a green space. Just to be with yourself and to sit with that uncomfortableness and listen to it, because often it's really important what it's saying to you. And in my case, grief, if it involves chicken wings and ice cream, it's often a really difficult grievance, because it means I need comfort food as well. But I have like little comfort foods that I keep around the flat anyway, but if it's actually chicken wings, you know it's bad. And then it's just sort of like processing what that means. And you don't have to have an answer to what that means. It's just understanding that that feeling is there. And in my case, often the reaction is, well, okay, that feeling is there. This entire situation is shit. I don't like it. I'm angry about it. I'm upset about it. And then going, okay, shit, I might take some time to process this, but what next? I have been dealt with these cards. I don't have control over this situation, as in, this is what has happened. I can't change it. But I can change how I react to it. I can change what I do next. I can decide to self-care some more. I can decide to put up a boundary or take down a boundary. I can decide to reach out and talk to somebody about it, whether that's in this Shine group or anybody in Shine, another cancer charity, an anonymous charity like Samaritans or Mind, where you might just need to have a phone call, get some therapy, whatever it is that you need to do to share the problem, because ultimately a problem shared means a problem halved in my case. I always say that, even if the other person isn't taking on your problem, but you sharing it means it's not yours on your own anymore. In that sense, you're still owning the problem, but it's at least no longer you carrying the whole thing. And then, yeah, it's about then working out what to do next. And for everybody, depending on what has caused this conversation to start, it will be very different. But it will be a circle of acceptance, denial, grief and anger, acceptance, denial, next steps, grief and anger. And you're just going to go through that over and over and over and over again. And as you start getting used to listening to yourself, and responding to that and doing it again, you're going to get better at it. And suddenly you're like, hey, I'm doing it again. It's grief time. I like to call her my dark and twisted. In fact, my friends now know her as my dark and twisty. My husband now knows her. So if dark and twisty is around, they know I need space. But they also know that if I need to send them a message because it's getting a bit too overwhelming and I need somebody to ground me, think I need grounding, and hence why that's where food, a good TV show, a blanket, sensory things you can feel to keep you grounded during the process is so important. Photos, whatever it is you need to just bring yourself back to reality a little bit, because it can get overwhelming and overthrown by those emotions.
It's such great advice, such great advice. And I think what I don't hear in any of that is you beating yourself up about having those feelings, which I think is something we can fall into. Which is that sort of like, you did. I did in the past. I used to feel really bad, especially I think when I was living at home and there was that pressure to get on with it. I feel really bad, feeling bad about feeling bad. And it did take a lot of time in therapy. And I remember one of my therapists going, why do you care if somebody else cares about what you're feeling? Like, why do you care what other people care about? Why are you caring for other people's feelings when you are upset? In the sense of, if you're upset about something that's happened to you, why are you caring about the perception of others about that? Either about the what's happened or about the how you're reacting to it. And it was really poignant, because actually, if I'm going through it, it's my journey and my own way of processing, why should I give a shit about anybody else on that? Yeah. And actually, that's when I started learning to say, actually, I need to process this myself. You know, my husband's amazing, but he's not going through what I'm going through, and I'm not going through what he's going through. He had a brain injury 10 years ago. He's got his own processing shit to get through. And
you know, sometimes he has his own, you know, fragile moments where he needs to self-care for himself, and that's okay. He's got his own dark and twisty to deal with. But yeah, and I like to think of it like a bit of a round table. So round table, brain, heart, soul, dark and twisty, anybody else that needs to be involved. If you're in conflict and overwhelmed, they tend to be yelling at each other. There's no clear path through and you don't really know what to do next. Eventually you sit them down like a United Nations Security Council and you get everybody talking. And eventually there will be consensus and you will find a way out, but you've got to have those conversations, and they might get incredibly uncomfortable and it might be a little bit like a Cold War at times.
Absolutely. And it's a bit about kind of almost someone else giving you permission, just having a space where you can have a conversation where someone else says, what do you do? Like kind of an objective. Counseling is a great place to do it. You know, shine meetups, we'll all meet up and go, what are you thinking? You're doing amazing. You need to, you know, just the affirmation to allow yourself to give yourself that time. I'm just aware of time, and I wanted to go, we've got Jassie's got a question and she's going to actually ask you.
Yes, that's all.
Directly, which is exciting.
It's not that exciting. So Anoushe, that was amazing. I could listen to you talk all day. I've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to keep it focused. When you talked about having that conversation with yourself and acknowledging when something's wrong in terms of either how your body feels or your mental health, that's something I really struggle with. I think because I'm scared of the answers or because I don't want to deal with it. So I would love to hear how you started to do that when the last thing you possibly want to do is kind of give airtime or concentrate on those things.
So I have some really classic behaviors for when I'm not giving myself the conversation because I am scared of the answer. And I don't always know I'm scared of the answer. It's just there's a natural behavior that starts. So I start working weekends. I start not sleeping because I stay up to do way too much crochet or crafting. I get really, really busy. Now, this month I'm giving 12 talks on top of training, on top of work, and on top of traveling. So we might just be in a little bit of phase where I might have been a bit scared of taking on an answer. Interestingly enough, a lot of these talks this month are actually my own personal experience. I'm actually processing that. So if you are very scared of the answer, I think what I normally do is I actually just go, what's the worst that can happen? Like my friend said, what is the worst? What's the ultimate worst answer that you can get and that you wouldn't be able to cope with? Right? And if that's an answer you think you can cope with, then it's worth having that conversation with yourself, because you know what your worst is going to be. You know, what's your boundary for what you can't cope with? And if you can't find that out, or you don't think you can cope with it, that's when I'd say getting some help, have that conversation, have that with somebody, then find a safe space to do that, because doing it on your own might be a bit ungrounding, there might be a bit unsafe for yourself. But also, the more you do this practice, the easier, I'm not going to say the easier it is to deal with hard questions and the hard answers, but the more you'll be equipped to deal with them. Because it's still processing emotions, it's still really, really hard. But you'll be more prepared to deal with maybe the more existential stuff that might come out. You know, the fundamental, where is my life going stuff, which can be honestly really hard. And just because you get an answer you're scared of or you're not quite ready to deal with doesn't mean you have to do anything about it there and then. Sit with the answer, put it on a piece of paper and leave it in a box for a while, physically in a box, so you know it's there for when you're next prepared to deal with it.
I like
build
that.
some self-caring routine around that, so you know, maybe have a negotiation with yourself. I'm going to do some self-care for an hour. I'm going to then think about what's in that box, and then I'm going to close the box, and then I'm going to go off and do some more self-care. So, you know, you've got some massive grounding, sandwiching that little bit of like, ugh, that you're going to have to do.
That's really good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we talk a little bit in, we run online programs for people, and we talk a bit about kind of active worrying, or actively giving time to think about the difficult things, because when it feels like you're suppressing it and not giving it airtime, it's just constantly there in the background, and that can make you feel all nervy and squirrely. But we kind of talk about this thing of like, well, I'm actually going to literally schedule half an hour in my week, and that's the time I'm going to sit and worry about this thing, and I'm going to give myself the space to kind of, and then every time it comes up and you're not in that time, you're like, it's okay, I don't have to do it now because I've scheduled some time for this worrying, and it can go. And of course, all these tips and tools don't work for everyone, but it's worth giving them a go, I think. I've got another question from John. Yes.
Yeah. So my hospital knows me as the boom and buster. So if anybody's familiar with boom and bust, which is the idea that you don't use your energy properly, but you kind of boom and then bust, that's me. I am a serial boom and buster. I'm known, it doesn't matter what people teach me about managing my energy. I'm just somebody who pushes through. I just bust. There'll be a point where I bust. I think over time, I've gotten very good at being very, very energetic, but I'm also very good at scheduling downtime if I'm going to manage to keep up with training. So, for instance, my Monday nights, I don't train. My Friday nights, I don't train. You know, if I train on the weekend, it's a little bit of a session. With the recent health issues, which are impacting my fatigue even more than they used to be, now the training has moved to be quality over quantity. So I'm not at the wall for 3 hours. I'm there for a good hour and I'm done. Because even getting to the wall is now starting to tire me out again, a bit like when I started climbing. So it feels like a bit of a setback from that perspective. And also because I'm so tired, it's becoming mentally more challenging to engage with the things that are requiring more energy, and emotionally more challenging. So I'm allowing myself more downtime to just cry and deal, because I'm also processing. Like, I'm actually processing the change, which is not easy. So I'm like, I know I'm firing on all cylinders on the emotional processing side, which means I'm not able to fire on all cylinders everywhere else, because it's just not possible. We're all human beings. We're not superhumans. So I'd say all cancer people are superhumans. Just because we have to cope with so much, we're forced to be in that position. So I'd say, look at what you've got on, prioritize what you need and what you want. And do you need to do everything else? Can you find a way? We have a cleaner. I have a husband who picks things up as well on top of the cleaner, so kind of like a second cleaner sometimes. He just does stuff I can't. We accept that there's going to be a certain amount of mess in the flat all the time. I accept that I don't always change my clothes because I can't. I don't have the energy at the end of the day. I meal prep because honestly, it makes our lives way easier. And then I dump loads of stuff into the freezer from those meal preps, besides the fact that it's cost effective and nutritious because it's homemade. It actually saves a hell of a lot of energy, especially if we're both training hard or getting our energy down, or both been traveling. Unexpected flares, thankfully I don't have as many anymore because I'm much more in tune with my body, so I can tell when a flare is coming and or I can avoid it. So I very rarely train into flare anymore. I used to a lot. There was a lot of pressure to train before because I was doing so well in the climbing and it was so new that I was like excited by it. I'd put pressure on myself to overtrain. I don't do that anymore. So there's been a conscious, and I'm a lot less injured as a consequence, actually. So I'm a lot healthier because I train smarter. I think we can all learn to do that. You can work smarter, you can train smarter, you can cook smarter, you can sleep smarter. There's so many things we can do better so that we stop short of actually pushing ourselves through that limit. And therefore you can sustain your lives much better. I know effectively, I guess that means I'm learning how to not boom and bust better. But don't get me wrong, I still boom and bust. If I've got a cold and I'm pushing through, I'm going to bust because my body does not like having infections in any way. And if one of those happens, bye-bye Anoushé for a couple of days because I'm going to be off sick and I'm just going to have to call it and say I'm sick and I can't do it. I think it's about learning what your triggers are really and getting the basics right. So sleep, eat, hydration, nature. I think nature or contact with a plant or green stuff is so important, and social connection. All four are five even are so important. And if you can get them, the basics regularly done, and if that means getting a bullet journal and bulleting it, getting a tracker on your phone, whatever else you need to do to get those basics sorted, you'll find often the other stuff becomes easier.
Yeah.
At least that's what I did.
It's great. And I just want to flag for the recording that the question was about fatigue there, and how you manage those fatigue kind of levels when you're being active. But I mean, fatigue is one of the, it's the cruelest thing, isn't it? Because what it does is we find things that help us, and we find things that make us feel like we're actively recovering and we're connecting to the world in ways that we couldn't when we're ill. And then you get fatigue, and the very thing that you would need to cope with fatigue are the things that you're too tired to do anymore. And it's just this spiral, and it's such a nightmare. So I think what you said is a really good, like, accepting some of it and not, but also just acknowledging to anyone in the group who's living with that, how frustrating it can be. It's that everlasting monster that's whispering in your ear. Yeah. I find it's always there. It's about how loud it gets. And when it's very loud, I listen to it. When it's not loud, I've learned to go, screw you, I'm carrying on, and get louder, and then I'll listen. So it's one of those things that I'm constantly living with it. I don't think I've had a single refreshing sleep in years. And that's just the reality of it. I'm always tired. I just don't always look tired. And then, yeah, as I said, the downtime that I do schedule in my week, and like, for instance, I'm giving an insane number of talks this month. I've deliberately not planned any talks for December. And people are trying, they're trying to get in the calendar, and I'm going, sorry, January, because no, I'm absolutely gone flat out this month, and I know I'm going to have to pay for it. How do you get into climbing? Find most walls in London, especially, but it's around the UK as well, are now very power friendly, because they're all aware of para climbers, because we've made such an impact through para climbing London. So most walls will be able to just go to a taster, tell them what your concerns are, go to a wall, have a phone call with them. I'd say if you're nervous about climbing in the first place, just go to the wall and just have a walkabout. And get to know the place before you even go and try it out, and then talk to somebody. Depending on where you are in the UK, there's loads of paraclimbing clubs in the UK now, so just get in touch with any of them. For paraclimbing London, just get in touch with me, and I can happy to take you along on any of my normal sessions, because we take newbies on all the time. And yeah, COVID has really been an issue. For climbing can be a bit of an expensive sport in terms of just entry fees and things like that. A lot of paraclimbing clubs will have subsidized entries to make that a little bit cheaper, and some paraclimbing organizations will have funding to help you with getting started. And there's lots of things that is around if that's something you want to pick up. I got funded for my first year, for instance, when I had to buy my first kit. So that was quite helpful to have those resources. And if you do decide to take it on, and you do want to buy some kit and stuff, there might be some funding available to do just
that.
to say that if anyone's thinking about it but they're a bit nervous, I've actually been climbing with Anoushe, and it was fantastic. Like, I am the least sporty, hated PE person, I just had absolutely no confidence that I was going to get up the wall, and I got to the top, and it was just the best feeling. It was a really wonderful thing, so I can definitely encourage it.
And then Jess is asking 5 things to prioritize when you're ill. I live with family now, Jess, and I've lived with family. I have had phases in my life where I've been living completely on my own, especially during the pandemic. And in the pandemic, I'd managed to dislocate my right knee, get a blood clot in my left knee, and they thought I'd had a cancer relapse to the point of terminal. I was living with that on my own in the flat, finding out on the same month I was supposed to be getting married, which wasn't ideal, and being scared of the world at the same time, which really wasn't ideal. Things to prioritize when you're ill: sleep or rest, because sleep isn't always the thing. I found, especially with cancer, post-cancer stuff, I really have a difficult relationship with resting, because I had to, chemo made me rest in a way I didn't like, and it's traumatized me a bit, so I don't rest very well. So I actively rest as a consequence. I do crafts, I sit in front of the TV and crochet, or I paint, or I do things, because I'm still resting, but I'm not doing anything, you see what I mean? So for me, that's my way of coping with rest. Some people will find other ways, but yeah, rest, or doing the rest that you can because your body needs it. That's the reality. Hydration. If you're struggling with food, I like lumping a hydration salt into my drinks to give me those electrolytes that just keep me hydrated properly, rather than just peeing all that water out. Foods you enjoy. So I always keep in the flat snacks or emergencies for on the days where I can't digest because my gut's bad or I'm ill and I cannot open the fridge because I don't have the strength to. Then there is a batch of snacks or emergencies. Some of them are nutritious and some of them are very much so not. It doesn't matter. It's about just having stuff I can get down me on that day that's still tasty and appetizing. And then if none of those work, then Deliveroo or Uber Eats or any of those or a neighbor are always good options to get them done. Good TV or music or entertainment, because you're going to be sitting around doing nothing-ish for a bit when you're ill. And then having a way to socialize, finding something to do. So whether that's joining a shine group, talking to friends. I find sometimes talking to my friends can get a bit burdensome because I get to just hear the same thing. I'm always ill. Like Claire, we were talking about being professionally ill. And I feel like it's a bit like somebody in one of my best friends groups asked everybody how they were, and nobody replied. But I think we all didn't reply because we're all going through our own mental health stuff, that we were all just like, what do we all say? But having somewhere you can speak. I'm part of an online gaming community where I'm anonymous. And I really like that because I am a public figure now. People do recognize me in the street every now and again. It can get a bit odd. I went to an MRI a couple of weeks ago where somebody was acting really quirky towards me. Turns out they were fangirling and told me after my appointment because they were the one dealing with me on the MRI bed. But it was still a bit quirky and awkward and lovely, and wished the guy a lovely weekend, and he was all smiles. But what I mean to say, it can get a bit much sometimes. So having a space for me where I'm completely anonymous and nobody knows who I am is just great, because I can just be a gamer on that and escape.
It's so fantastic to have you, Anoushe. I'm like Jess said, we could talk for hours, I'm sure, and it would never get dull. But we have come to the end of the session. I just want to thank you so much for coming along and chatting with us. It's been so fantastic to hear. And this recording, will be available to anyone who's missed it. I'm going to stop recording now.